Think the Middle Ages were all about prayer, chastity, and quiet devotion. Think again, because medieval sexuality wasn't just alive, it was feral, and nowhere is this more bizarre, more grotesque, than in the tradition of bundling. Imagine a world where your parents, instead of encouraging polite courtship, tied you into a sack, shoved you into bed with a stranger, and called it romance. The room is dim, lit only by the flicker of a tallow candle. The smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies hangs heavy in the air. You're young, nervous, and staring at the person you might be expected to marry, but there's no privacy, no freedom to choose. Instead, a wooden plank is placed between your bodies, a cold, crude barrier, and then you're bound into a sack, cinched tight at the neck. The message is clear. You may share warmth, you may share words, but you must not, under any circumstances, share flesh. This was bundling, the medieval equivalent of a supervised sleepover. Families across rural Europe encouraged it. Parents would cheerfully arrange these strange nights as a way for young couples to get to know each other. Entire villages accepted it as normal. It wasn't some fringe practice, it was woven into the culture, but the results were not what parents intended. Historical records show pregnancy rates among bundled couples were far higher than among those who courted in more traditional ways, and really, who could be surprised? Two teenagers, lying in the dark, pressed together by heavy blankets, sharing breath, sharing nervous laughter, forbidden to touch. What did people think would happen? The hypocrisy was staggering. Religious leaders condemned bundling with fiery sermons, calling it immoral, sinful, dangerous. They warned that it led directly to temptation, yet they couldn't stop it. Just like today's battles over social media or teenage rebellion, parents and priests were powerless to ban what had already become a deeply ingrained part of rural life. Bundling persisted for centuries, and it wasn't just improvised either. An entire economy formed around it. Artisans sewed bundling bags, heavy sacks with drawstrings, specially made for this purpose. Carpenters carved bundling boards, those infamous planks of wood meant to keep young lovers separated in bed. Imagine it, whole industries profiting from the bizarre effort to make intimacy impossible, while simultaneously forcing it closer. The irony is chilling. Families spent money to restrict their children, yet every restraint only heightened the temptation. Every whispered warning, every heavy board, every knot tied tight in the sack, all of it made the forbidden more enticing. For the young people forced into these strange encounters, bundling must have felt like a twisted game of endurance. Hours spent lying awake, inches from another body, listening to the beating of someone else's heart, the rise and fall of their breath, the kind of tension that gnaws at the mind, the kind that twists desire into something almost unbearable. Sometimes the rules broke, sometimes the board slipped, or the sack came undone, or hands found their way where they were not supposed to go, and when they did, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Swollen bellies, whispered gossip, shame carried not just by the couple, but by their families. Yet still, bundling continued. The church may have condemned it, but communities clung to it with stubborn pride. To them, this was tradition. This was morality. This was the way things were done, and so generation after generation, the bizarre ritual repeated itself. Bundling reveals something profound about medieval life. It wasn't simply about love, or even lust. It was about control, about a society obsessed with restraining the natural desires of the young, while pretending to create safe moral structures. A society that tied its children into sacks, and pretended this was purity. But if bundling was strange, it was only the beginning, because the same culture that invented bundling also believed that desire could be cooked, plated, and devoured, that lust could be summoned at a banquet table. In noble halls across Europe, feasts were held not just to celebrate wealth and power, but to stoke sexual appetite. Men and women gathered to eat dishes of roasted animal testicles, sparrow brains and organs drenched in spice, believing each bite heightened passion. This was not dinner, this was ritual, a grotesque marriage of appetite and desire, and if bundling was meant to prevent intimacy, the medieval Aphrodisiac feast existed to guarantee it. In the medieval world, food was never just food. It wasn't about survival, it wasn't even about celebration. For the wealthy, dining became something darker, a ritual designed to stir hunger not only of the stomach, but of the flesh. This was the age of aphrodisiac feasts. Imagine stepping into the banquet hall of a nobleman's castle. The air is heavy with the mingled smells of roasting meat and exotic spices. Tapestries glow in the flicker of candlelight, shadows dancing across painted saints who look down in silent judgment. At the head of the table sits the host, a lord with a sly grin, his guests waiting expectantly for the first course. And then, the dishes arrive. Not venison, not roasted fowl, no, the centerpiece is a steaming platter of animal testicles, bull, ram, or boar, carved and seasoned with expensive spices. To the medieval mind, eating the organs of virile beasts was the surest way to absorb their strength, their fertility, their lust. They didn't call them testicles. They called them stones, as if polite words could hide the grotesque truth. They were roasted, boiled, fried, ground into powder and stirred into wine. There was no limit to how these stones could be served. Each method promised the same thing: passion, potency, and power in bed. But the feast didn't stop there. Tiny sparrow brains, swallowed in delicate bites, believed to spark desire because of the bird's restless, flitting energy. Reproductive organs from every manner of beast, plated and presented like delicacies. Medieval cooks truly believed, eat fertility, and you create fertility, and the spices. They weren't for taste, they were for lust. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, saffron, traded across dangerous seas, sold at prices worth more than gold, all of them believed to kindle sexual fire. The same spices we sprinkle harmlessly on desserts today were once treated like powerful drugs. Wealthy nobles turned their weddings into full-blown lust rituals. Guests sat at tables groaning under the weight of 7-course meals, designed not for elegance but for arousal. Imagine raising a goblet of wine spiced with saffron and laced with powdered bull testicle, toasting the bride and groom as if offering them not blessings, but fuel for the marriage bed. Even the wedding cake was corrupted. Honey, pine nuts and almonds weren't chosen for sweetness. They were chosen for stimulation. Every bite was meant to carry a secret promise: more children, more heirs, more power for the family line. And here's where it turns even more surreal. These aphrodisiac recipes weren't whispered secrets passed in back rooms. They weren't naughty folk remedies. They were codified, documented, respected. Medieval physicians wrote entire treatises, medical texts with names like "On the Generation of Semen and Foods That Increase Lust." Scholars pored over them. Students copied them. They weren't considered scandalous. They were considered science. In fact, the obsession with aphrodisiac food grew so extreme that the church had to intervene. Certain ingredients were banned during fasting seasons, not because they were too indulgent, but because they were too stimulating. Imagine being told that eating saffron on a Friday might tempt your soul into sin, that even a taste of pepper could be enough to steer you toward damnation. But that's the paradox of the medieval world. Publicly, chastity was preached. Publicly, purity was demanded. And yet, in private, behind the stone walls of castles and manors, entire cultures of lust thrived, and they thrived around the table. It is grotesque to think of a family gathering where uncles, cousins, priests and knights all leaned over platters of cooked animal organs, laughing and drinking, fully aware of what these foods were meant to provoke. The air thick with the smell of roasting flesh, the oily gleam of fat dripping from meat, meant not for nourishment, but for lust. This wasn't nourishment. It was psychological theater. Every bite whispered to the guests, "You are stronger, you are hungrier, you are ready." And here's the chilling thought. Imagine being the bride, sitting at that table, every eye on you, every dish designed to inflame not just the guests but you and your new husband. You would have been expected to smile, to eat, to drink, to swallow dishes of organs and spices, while knowing exactly what the night would bring. It wasn't a feast, it was a countdown. The medieval aphrodisiac banquet reveals something terrifying about the human psyche, the way societies can transform desire into ritual, appetite into spectacle, lust into ceremony. These meals were never simply about eating. They were about control, about ensuring heirs, ensuring alliances, ensuring power passed cleanly through generations. Food became a weapon in the endless war for lineage. And yet, even this was not the height of medieval sexual spectacle. Because if bundling trapped young lovers in sacks, and aphrodisiac feasts fueled lust with grotesque meals, the bedding ceremony took it to the next level. A wedding was not complete until it was consummated, and consummation was not private. It was public, witnessed, recorded. Imagine your first night as husband and wife, not alone, but surrounded by nobles, bishops, even family members, all waiting, watching, as you undressed, climbed into bed, and proved your marriage was real. That was the medieval wedding night. If you think meeting your partner's parents is awkward, imagine this: your entire wedding party, a hall full of nobles and priests following you into your bedroom. Imagine strangers crowding around your bed, not to wish you well, but to watch you lose your virginity. This was the medieval bedding ceremony, a ritual so humiliating, so grotesque, that it turned the most private moment of marriage into public theatre. The logic was twisted but simple. In the Middle Ages, a marriage was not truly valid until it was consummated. And marriages weren't just about love, they were contracts. Contracts involving land, power, alliances, and money, so the consummation had to be proven, not whispered about, not assumed, proven, witnessed. And that meant the wedding guests, relatives, church officials, high-ranking nobles, marched the couple straight from the altar to the bedchamber. The bride, trembling, was stripped of her gown by female relatives. The groom was undressed by the men of his family. Gender-segregated strip shows, performed as ritual. Then came the moment. The couple placed together in bed, curtains thrown wide, and the audience remained. Sometimes they stood in silence, sometimes they laughed, jeered, or shouted advice. There are accounts of bishops offering prayers as the act began, as if God himself were required to bless this humiliating spectacle, and it did not end quickly. Witnesses stayed for the entire duration. They did not simply peek behind the curtain and leave. They lingered, watching, listening, waiting for evidence that the contract had been sealed. But even that was not always enough. In some cases, officials demanded proof afterward. The stained sheets carried out and displayed to the crowd, examined for blood, for semen, for signs that the act had truly been performed. Imagine holding up your bedsheets like a courtroom exhibit, your intimacy reduced to forensic evidence. It is grotesque beyond words. Yet this was not rare. This was not limited to kings and queens. Any marriage involving property, inheritance, or political stakes could require it. Thousands of couples across medieval Europe endured this ritual humiliation, and if the consummation was not properly witnessed, the marriage could be annulled. There are court records where marriages were declared invalid because the audience had not seen enough. The couple was forced to try again, this time with proper supervision. Think of the psychological horror. A young bride, barely more than a child, surrounded by strangers as she's undressed and placed in bed. A young groom, terrified of failure, his manhood judged not in private but in front of nobles who controlled his family's fortunes. Failure meant disgrace. Success meant humiliation of a different kind. Etiquette manuals from the time even outlined the rules: where to stand, what to say, how long to remain. Voyeurism was formalized. Humiliation was ritualized. What should have been a moment of intimacy became state business, and there were darker whispers. Accounts of bedding ceremonies where drunken guests crossed the line, where relatives and courtiers touched, mocked, or interfered, where the bride's body became not just a symbol of alliance but an object of entertainment. Imagine the fear of being treated as nothing more than a vessel, your dignity stripped away under the eyes of those who held power over you. Why did this persist? Because marriage in the Middle Ages was never just about two people. It was about dynasties. It was about the transfer of land and bloodlines. The body of the bride was not her own. It was a contract to be signed in flesh. The groom was not simply a man. He was a vessel of lineage. His potency required not just for his wife, but for the survival of entire estates. In this grotesque theatre, sex was stripped of intimacy. It became evidence, proof, a performance. And it leaves us with a chilling question. What does it do to a society when the most private act becomes public ritual, when pleasure is erased, and only power remains? The bedding ceremony was not an anomaly. It was part of a pattern, a world where intimacy was planned, controlled, and weaponized. Because if weddings demanded public sex, then childbearing demanded something even stranger: schedules, astrological consultations. In the Middle Ages, even conception itself was planned with military precision. Aristocrats turned to priests, physicians, and astrologers to tell them when to have sex, what direction the bed should face, even which testicle a man should tie off if he wanted a son. Sex became not only a performance, but a calculation. Sex in the Middle Ages wasn't just passion. It wasn't just duty. For the aristocracy, it was strategy. Imagine planning your wedding night the way a general plans a siege. Charts consulted, stars mapped, priests summoned to weigh in on the alignment of the heavens, physicians called to advise on bodily humors. The act of conceiving a child became a ritual of calculation, a calendar of flesh. Aristocrats obsessed over timing. It wasn't enough to lie with your spouse. You had to lie with them at the right moment. Medieval medicine insisted conception was only successful when the woman's body was in the proper humoral balance. Not too hot, not too cold, not too wet or dry. One misstep, and the chance was lost. Astrology complicated things further. Couples sought the waxing moon, the rising sun, the moment when planets aligned in fertile houses. Some believed certain saints' feast days carried blessings for conception, while others forbade sex entirely on holy days. The result, a breeding schedule so complex it made intimacy feel more like an astronomical event than a human act. Even the time of night mattered. Midnight was considered the optimal hour, when the body's energies were most potent. The bed itself had to face east, toward the rising sun, as if new life required the blessing of dawn. If the weather was wrong, too cold, too dry, conception was thought impossible. A summer storm might cancel an entire night of planned passion. Then came gender selection. If a couple desired a son, the man was told to tie off his left testicle, since boys were believed to come from the right, girls from the left, a grotesque ritual of knots and cords, born from anatomical ignorance. Other texts recommended specific sexual positions, prayers whispered at climactic moments, or herbs scattered beneath the bed to sway fate toward a boy or girl. But restrictions loomed everywhere. The church forbade sex on Sundays, on Wednesdays, on Fridays, during Lent, during Advent, during menstruation, during pregnancy, during breastfeeding. In total, nearly half the calendar was declared off-limits. Couples were left with a patchwork of permissible days, often so few that intimacy became a logistical nightmare. Wealthy families turned desperation into business. They hired fertility consultants, learned men who combined priestly authority, medical knowledge, and astrological calculation. These men designed personalized sex calendars, telling couples not only when to conceive but how. Families paid fortunes for these services, desperate to secure heirs, desperate to ensure survival, and the pressure was immense. In noble houses, the future of estates depended on successful births. A failed conception wasn't just disappointment, it was a political disaster. Heirs meant power. Without them, alliances crumbled, rival families closed in, and bloodlines withered into extinction. Imagine the weight of that responsibility, pressing down on a young couple, every night together haunted by the question, did we do it right? Was the timing correct? Were the stars aligned? Failure wasn't private. Failure was recorded, judged, whispered about by courtiers and priests alike. In some cases, families traveled hundreds of miles to conceive in the right place at the right hour. Geography itself was thought to influence the child's fate. A son conceived in one region might be stronger, braver, more capable than one conceived elsewhere. The body was no longer a site of love or desire. It was a battlefield, a clock, a set of coordinates to be manipulated, measured, and judged. When we look back, the cruelty becomes clear. What should have been moments of intimacy, of joy, were twisted into rituals of anxiety. A husband reduced to a function, a wife reduced to a vessel, both caught in a system that transformed their very flesh into a tool of dynastic survival. The medieval breeding schedule was not about life. It was about control, and in that control we see a society terrified of chance, terrified of failure, and willing to bind even the most natural act in chains of ritual. In the medieval imagination, even clothing could decide the future of a family. The garments pressed against your skin weren't just fabric, they were vessels of prayer, magic, and hope. And in no case was this more grotesque than the girdle of Venus. The girdle was no ordinary belt. It was a strip of silk or linen, inscribed with prayers, symbols, or charms, wrapped tightly around the hips of a woman. It was believed to ensure fertility, protect during childbirth, and enhance desire. Some were embroidered with crosses and invocations, others bore astrological signs and mysterious diagrams. They were both relic and restraint, faith and superstition woven together in thread. To wear a girdle was to carry the weight of expectation. Families demanded heirs, and so daughters were given these belts, not as gifts but as obligations. They pressed against the body as constant reminders that a woman's worth was measured not by her spirit, not by her will, but by her womb. And it didn't stop with belts. Women carried fertility amulets, tiny pouches filled with powders and relics. Ground gemstones, emeralds for boys, sapphires for girls, diamonds for twins, were thought to shape the destiny of the child. Unicorn horn, often nothing more than narwhal tusk, was powdered and worn against the skin, believed to carry mystical potency. Some charms held prayers scrawled on parchment, as if God needed a written reminder to intervene in the bedchamber. The most grotesque of all was the conception stone, smooth crystals placed inside undergarments during intercourse, thought to channel fertility into the womb. Imagine the discomfort, the indignity, and yet, the desperation was so great that women endured it willingly, convinced that salvation for their family line rested in a cold stone, pressed between their thighs. Men had their own arsenal. Blessed loincloths said to enhance virility, rings worn on particular fingers, supposedly channeling power into the groin, amulets filled with animal parts, usually testicles, always testicles, dangling beneath their robes like grotesque talismans of manhood. And the church, it did not stay on the sidelines. Priests blessed belts, charms and even bed linens. For a price, a fertility belt without a priestly blessing was considered powerless, and so hopeful couples paid fees to have their underwear consecrated. It became, in effect, a subscription service of salvation. Sex lives turned into revenue streams for the clergy. Some girdles were so elaborately constructed that they came with instructions. Manuals explained which prayers to recite while tying the belt, how long to wear it, and what to do if it failed. Imagine a woman, night after night, whispering desperate prayers as she fastened embroidered silk around her body, terrified that without it she would remain barren, disgraced, cast aside. The wealthy flaunted their girdles like jewels. Gold thread, imported silk, gemstones stitched into fabric. Fertility became a luxury commodity. The poor made do with scraps of cloth, local herbs, and crude charms. Even in desperation, class determined your chances. The body itself became divided into hierarchies of wealth, and for many women, the belief in these objects became unshakable. Some refused to lie with their husbands without their belts or stones. Others were rejected outright by men who refused to risk conception without the proper protections. Intimacy was chained not only by ritual, but by fabric, talisman, and stone. What is most haunting is not that people believed these objects worked. It is what their existence reveals. A society that reduced intimacy to transaction, faith to superstition, and love to desperation. The girdle was not worn out of desire. It was worn out of fear. Fear of barrenness, fear of failure, fear of becoming obsolete in a world where women without children were discarded like broken vessels. Every embroidered word, every etched charm was a scream written in silk. Give me a child, give me an heir, give me purpose. And when the belts failed, when the amulets proved powerless, when the stones did nothing, women were often blamed, condemned as cursed, as sinful, as unworthy. The girdle promised hope. More often, it delivered shame. The medieval girdle of Venus is more than a curious relic. It is a symbol of how deeply control and superstition invaded the most intimate parts of life. A reminder that beneath the silks and prayers was always the same truth. The body itself was never private. It was owned, watched, judged, and bound by the expectations of others. If you think modern divorce proceedings are humiliating, imagine this. Standing in a courtroom, accused not of theft, not of treason, but of impotence. Your spouse has declared you incapable of fulfilling your marital duties, and the only way to prove otherwise is to have sex, in public, under supervision. This was the nightmare of medieval impotence trials. For women trapped in miserable marriages, impotence was one of the very few grounds for annulment. But proving it required more than testimony. It demanded a public investigation into the most private details of a couple's life. Judges, physicians, even strangers were summoned to determine whether a man could perform. The process was brutal. First came the medical examinations. Physicians prodding and inspecting, searching for defects, abnormalities, excuses. Then came interrogation. Under oath, both husband and wife were forced to describe their sex life in humiliating detail. Frequency, performance, failures, sensations, nothing was off limits. But when words and exams weren't enough, the court demanded more. The trial by Congress. In a rented chamber, the couple was ordered to attempt intercourse under supervision. Officials peered through peepholes, priests listened behind screens, physicians waited nearby. The man was given a set amount of time to perform. If he failed, his marriage could be annulled. If he succeeded, his humiliation was permanent. Some men tried to cheat. They smuggled in herbs, concoctions or crude aphrodisiacs. Some rubbed their bodies with ointments of ground animal parts, desperate to force an erection. If caught, the shame deepened, and the examiners searched even more thoroughly. stripping men of dignity in the name of truth. The trials dragged on for months, sometimes years. Some couples were forced to repeat the act again and again, like prisoners in a perverse theatre, their bodies reduced to exhibits in a case file. Whether the verdict was impotence or competence, both reputations were ruined. Gossip spread faster than judgment. Villages whispered, nobles laughed, reputations rotted, and the cruelty wasn't only aimed at men. Women were also examined. If a husband failed, it was sometimes claimed the wife was at fault, that her lack of beauty, passion, or warmth had withered his desire. Women were touched, prodded, questioned about their own responses, forced to prove that they were not the obstacle. In a society where everything was controlled, even pleasure itself became a weapon of blame. Many men chose disgrace over trial. They accepted annulment without testing, rather than face the horror of supervised failure. Others endured, and their names became twisted jokes in the gossip of towns. The Impotence trial destroyed far more lives than it saved. But this grotesque obsession with control was not limited to marriage. For all its sermons on chastity, the medieval church was building something far darker, a sex empire. In London, in Paris, in countless cities across Europe, prostitution thrived, not in spite of the church, but under its direct management. Bishops leased properties to brothel keepers, collected taxes from prostitutes, and used the money to fund monasteries, churches, and holy festivals. The justification was cynical. Prostitution was a necessary evil, better to contain it, they argued, than to risk adultery, sodomy, or rape, so the church became the silent landlord of sin. Regulations were strict. Prostitutes had to dress in certain colors, forbidden from wearing the finery of honest women. They worked designated hours, in designated districts, under constant surveillance. They were forbidden from refusing customers, forbidden from working on holy days, forced into medical inspections to ensure they remained fit for service. The money flowed upward in layers of exploitation. Prostitutes paid rent to keepers, who paid rent to landlords, who paid taxes to bishops. At the bottom, women, desperate and disposable. At the top, the church, pocketing the profits of flesh, while thundering from pulpits about purity. The hypocrisy is staggering. The same priests who blessed fertility belts, who condemned bundling, who banned spices for being too stimulating. These same men funded their cathedrals with the sweat and suffering of women sold in church-owned brothels. For centuries, this system thrived. Reformers tried to end it, but resistance was fierce. Too much money flowed through the flesh trade for morality to win. It was only with the rise of Protestant reform and shifting social tides that the church's brothel empire finally collapsed. But for hundreds of years, salvation itself was bankrolled by sin. And in the shadow of this empire, people still searched for ways to avoid conception, crude, desperate methods that bordered on torture. Women drank potions of ground iron, of mercury, of pulverized beaver testicles mixed with wine. Some poisoned themselves in the attempt. Others stuffed their bodies with honey-soaked wool, with crocodile dung, with half a lemon pressed against the cervix. Physicians told women to sneeze after sex, believing the force expelled semen. Most of these methods failed. Some killed. But all of them reveal the same truth. Medieval life reduced desire to a battlefield of desperation. People would try anything, no matter how absurd, how painful, how deadly, to seize control of their bodies in a world determined to strip them of it. When we look back on this world of bundling sacks, aphrodisiac feasts, public consummations, breeding calendars, magical girdles, impotence trials, and church-run brothels, it feels grotesque, absurd, almost unbelievable. But behind every ritual, every feast, every trial, lies the same haunting reality. Sex was never private. It was always watched, always judged, always controlled by parents, by priests, by physicians, by the state. Desire was chained, ritualized, humiliated, and yet, it never disappeared. If anything, the more it was suppressed, the more grotesque it became, and perhaps that is the darkest revelation of all. The Middle Ages weren't dark because people weren't having sex. They were dark because of what people were forced to do when they did. Medieval love wasn't romance. It was ritual, it was control, and sometimes, it was horror. If you want more stories they never taught you in school, like this video and subscribe to Shrouded History. Hit the bell so you never miss the next tale of forbidden feasts, grotesque rituals, and royal tragedy. And tell me in the comments, which medieval ritual horrified you most? Bundling, aphrodisiac feasts, or the trial by Congress?